Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that I find you well. Thank you so much for joining for the third webinar. Today, we are going to be having a look at questions and questioning in the classroom. I'll wait another minute just to allow people to be able to join us live, and then I will get started. Hopefully, there were no noise issues. I've had to crack my window open a little bit. Obviously, if you are in the UK, you will know the heat wave we're going through right now. So hopefully it isn't too loud for you. Any issues at all, please just pop comments into the little chat or the question function. And then in a minute or two, we will get cracking. For those of you who haven't managed to join for the last couple of webinars, all of the recordings are up and available on my website. I will continue to make sure that everything is recorded and uploaded onto my website as soon after each of the presentations has finished as is possible. So again, after this one is all finished off today around 4:30 UK time, I will of course download it and then get it and then re-upload it up onto my website. Nobody's reporting any issues at the minute. We've just ticked over to 3:31, so I'm going to get cracking on today's webinar. So, like I say, any issues, please pop something into the chat. I will hopefully be able to come over to it. But otherwise, please enjoy the next 45 minutes to an hour as I explore a number of things in relation to questioning. And I try to sort of keep myself together in the sauna of my room. Of the study, and yeah, please enjoy, and hopefully you get a lot out of this one as well. So we are, of course, on to the third of the webinars today. You will see the slight change, and I think this tricked a few people. It was always the 10th of July, quite why I wrote the 8th of July on the advert, I'm not sure. And then I think I updated it to the 10th of July as we are today. All of the other dates are correct, so I will be seeing people again next week, on next Tuesday, on the 15th. So that date is correct. So we've got one next Tuesday, next Thursday, and then the following Tuesday as well. I appreciate a lot of people are already on holiday, and so a lot of people are going to be catching up on the recordings. But for those of you who are able to join me live, that is absolutely fantastic. So today, like I say, it's the third in our webinar journey where we will be exploring what makes questions effective and how we can make those questions metacognitive. And then we will be having a look in the next few weeks at things like developing feedback and evaluation, independent learners and developing resilience within the classroom. And then we're going to wrap it up with having a look at effective revision. As ever, I sort of top and tail with my little ask. I think a lot of you who have joined me live or have caught up on the sessions now know what I'm sort of the little favor I'm asking. Please do share any feedback, any photos, any comments across social media, just to build a bit of a conversation and just to bring a bit of metacognitive awareness to all of those education conversations that are happening. That would be absolutely fantastic if you were able to do that. And like I've said before, if you are in a position where you are able to sort of donate a little bit to keeping these webinars free, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the aim was to sort of run these for free. Little did I know the cost that it would that would be incurred by having the emails and the webinar facilities to record and broadcast to sort of 2,000 people. So anything that you are able to contribute, any contribution that you believe that the training is worth, would be very much appreciated. And thank you to all of those people who have made a contribution over the last couple of weeks as well. Contracting sessions, again, most people will be aware it isn't the easiest of platforms because of the no microphones webinar platform that we have for you to be able to ask questions. You're more than welcome to put down any questions that you do have into the chat function, but obviously there's no co-host. I cannot guarantee, sorry, that I will be able to get to those questions. It may be that there's an opportunity at the end for a little Q&A, especially today where there's a little less input and we may not run to the full hour. However, what people have really been fantastic at doing is taking advantage of just dropping me an email, asking me questions, asking me follow-up stuff, asking me for further information on some of the things that I raise within the webinar. So Please keep doing that. Please keep reaching out to me. Please do keep asking your questions and carrying on those metacognitive discussions and sort of evaluations as you consider your next steps for the next academic year. Today is a really, really exciting session, which all revolves around the use of and the effectiveness of questioning. Now, our last session was around modelling, and one of the things that we said during the modelling session is that modelling is integral to every single lesson. If we're going to be delivering a really good lesson, or just any lesson at all, then modelling is a key part of that. And it's exactly the same actually with questioning. It will be very, very hard to get through any sort of teaching episode, any sort of learning episode, any sort of student interaction without posing a question. And in fact, if we're not constantly posing questions and asking students, then what are we doing? We really do need to be doing that. Questions are an integral part of our arsenal to understand where students are up to and getting a little bit of feedback on our own teaching and our own modelling. So we're going to explore in a little bit more depth why questioning is so important. And then we're going to consider what exactly makes questioning effective and what doesn't make it effective. We're going to explore a few practices that maybe have dripped in to schools and classrooms, and we're going to explore why those habits maybe aren't as effective as other habits that we could look to break and to develop in the classroom. And then we will, of course, move on to those metacognitive aspects. So the first half of the session is going to be around questioning more broadly, but then the second half of the session is going to be having a look at a range of different questioning types that will help us to develop metacognition in our classroom, develop that culture of metacognition, and of course, upskill our young people to really maximize the progress that they're making in our classrooms. I always go to this Daniel Willingham quote. I mean, there isn't a day that goes by really where I don't reflect upon this. And the quote, and I'm trying to think if I've got his book right in front of me or if it's behind me somewhere. The quote from his book from, it's about 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, wasn't it? Memory is the residue of thought. And obviously we know that learning is a long-term change in our memory. So in effect, learning is the residue of thought. And the way that I think about this quote is that unless we direct student attention to a specific concept or idea or skill or strategy or approach, the student is not going to remember it, they're not going to learn it. So if we're wanting students to develop a deeper understanding, if we're wanting students to learn something, then we need to ensure that the spotlight is directly placed upon that one idea. And the analogy I've got here is a spotlight on the stage, and maybe you go off to the theatre and you're watching a show, and you may have a spotlight and it draws attention to all of the cast. You know, you've got your spotlight sort of drawn back a little bit, and it displays all of the cast. And so you sort of you're sort of watching everybody, you're seeing how the show goes. But actually, if you really want everybody in the audience to focus in on just the one actor who's doing something in a particular point or in a particular scene, then you need to direct that spotlight onto that individual, because otherwise people are going to be distracted looking at different things, the set, the villain, whatever it might be. If we want people to direct their attention to the one actor and whatever it is they're doing, the spotlight gets placed upon them, and that ensures that people are concentrating on the thing that we as the playwright, as the author, want them to focus on. And we have also an artist in much the same way in our classroom, that if we're wanting students to learn particular things, it's why it's so important that we isolate those specific things that we want students to be learning, and then we ensure that the spotlight is shone directly upon them and isn't so broad that it is encapsulating multiple other concepts at the same time. So, in short, we need to ensure that we are placing that spotlight on the thing that we need students to think about, because if students don't think about it, then students aren't going to be learning it. So what makes a good question then? If a question allows us to place a spotlight on a particular thing, if a question allows us to concentrate student thinking in a specific area, then what makes that question good? Now, I believe that in sort of the first instance, something that makes a question good is if it allows us to develop or to provide us with additional information that we didn't otherwise have around student understanding. So by asking a question, we ought to know more about what students can and cannot do than before we ask the question. And actually, if we're asking a question and we haven't gleaned any of that information from the question, then it probably wasn't a particularly good question. So if we wanted to know if students really understand what stage 3 is in the formation of a waterfall, and we ask them a question and we find out they know what stage 1 is or we know what stage 5 is, then maybe that wasn't a particularly good question if we didn't get them to focus in on stage 3, for example. So a good question will allow us to place the spotlight on the thing that we're trying to assess and understand whether the students themselves understand. So that's one half of what makes a good question. And I think the other half of what makes a good question is it's also providing a student with new information that helps them move forward. Because by virtue of answering a question, a student should be able to test themselves to see if they do understand the concept that they've just been talking about, or maybe linking back to, or maybe retrieving, or maybe trying to deduce. So it should provide students with some level of feedback or some level of self-evaluation that allows them to understand more about what it is that they do and do not know at that given point in time. Now, okay, say that we all agree on that questions give us more information and they give students more information to allow them to drive themselves forward. But how do we get questions spot on? What is it that we need to do that will allow us to nail questions? I have a rather tortured analogy that I'm going to share with you around questioning and how it is just like playing darts. Now, if you were to go up and play darts against me, maybe you'd have lots and lots and lots and lots of opportunities to, get the double 8 or get the double 12 or whatever it might be to finish off the round, to finish off the leg. That's because I'm not particularly good at darts. However, if you were playing somebody who was particularly good at darts, you're not going to have many opportunities. You're going to need to land those darts on the right point on the board in order to win the leg. You can't just keep throwing darts in the hope that they're going to eventually land where you need them to land. There is going to be a finite number of darts that you're going to be able to throw before the time is up, before you've lost the leg. And actually, questioning is a little bit like that as well. And you might think, well, I can ask lots and lots and lots of questions. And it's true. You can ask lots and lots and lots of questions. But we need to ensure that those questions are hitting the right spots, because we cannot spend our 60-minute lesson just asking loads of questions over and over again until we finally ask the right one, until we finally ask the question that allows us to understand what a student does and does not know. If our students aren't particularly well phrased, or they're not pitched at maybe the correct level of difficulty, or maybe they aren't directed at the right student, then we can't just keep asking over and over. We actually need to ensure that we're pitching questions at the right level of difficulty. We need to ensure that we're asking the right student, and we need to ensure that we're phrasing those questions in the correct way to get the information that we need. So what does that mean then for our questioning? And I think what it means is, regardless of any stage in our career, we need to be considering a couple of things. The first thing that we need to consider is that we need to be planning out our questions. We cannot just go into questioning blind. If we just go in there and start throwing out questions, we're going to keep missing the target. We'd be very, very fortunate to keep hitting and asking exactly the right questions over and over. And maybe if you've taught that topic every single year for 20 years and you've really honed your questioning skills in that topic area, maybe you'll be okay. But actually, in the main, we need to be planning out our questions in the same way that we would plan out the concepts that we want our students to learn in a lesson. We also ought to plan out the questions that we're going to ask to ensure that we're making that students are making progress against those outcomes that we want them to achieve. So that's the first thing. We need to be planning out our questions. We also need to ensure that we're pitching those questions and building those questions at an appropriate level of difficulty. And I always go back to Goldilocks here. The fantastic story of Goldilocks, where things were too big, too small, and then just right, too hot, too cold, and then just right. Goldilocks is the idea of getting things just right. And it's very, very difficult, isn't it, with questions, to ask a question and not pitch it in, correctly. It's very easy to ask a question which is just too straightforward, and it's so automatic it just didn't need to be asked. I mean, if you've ever seen a maths lesson, if you're a maths teacher, what you'll have often seen or what you'll have often done is asked a simple multiplication or simple addition or subtraction question that you just didn't need to ask. Okay, and what's 7 plus 3? It's 10. Okay, I really didn't need to ask that because actually we're factorising quadratics and all of my students know what 7 plus 10 is. So we often ask questions which are too simple for fear that we need to be asking questions or maybe to increase engagement in the classroom. Well, it's not helpful if we're using questions for those purposes. That's not going to be helpful. We're also at risk of asking questions which are too difficult, and sometimes that's our sort of expert blindness and we assume too much. Sometimes we're just not quite sure on the phrasing and we almost ask a question which is, guess what I'm thinking right now? What's the word or what's the phrase in my head? And again, unsurprisingly, that isn't particularly helpful. So getting that pitch right is difficult, but it is definitely something that allows us to reflect and improve on our own questioning. So we need to plan out those questions. We need them to be the appropriate level of difficulty. We need them to build in difficulty. We need to ensure this because we can't just ask questions all lesson long that are ineffective and unhelpful in moving ourselves or our students forward. Our questions need to hit the target. They need to get the information from them that we were aiming for. So that's why questioning is important, but how do we go about doing it? And the reason why I included this sort of section here about different types of questioning and about how we do it correctly is based off a couple of things. The first is that it's something that a lot of schools and a lot of colleges are still asking. How do we ensure that questioning is done effectively? And the second thing is based off observation of several hundred lessons this year. And the thing that I see over and over and over and over again, unfortunately, are things like cold calling being used ineffectively. And we're leaving gains basically on the table. We're leaving efficiency on the table by not using these strategies in the most effective ways. So, what can we do, therefore, to improve cold calling? Now, the first thing that I would say is that we need to move away from lollipop sticks and random name generators, and we need to move towards teacher-led cold calling. The purpose of a question is to ascertain whether a student does or doesn't know something. It is a point of assessment. And so why, when we're trying to measure the understanding of a student, would we want to rely on the randomness of lollipop sticks or random name generators? Perhaps it builds in fairness, supposedly, or perhaps it builds in, it supports a culture. But actually, effective cold calling will ensure that all of our students can learn more effectively and at a better rate. And so that is fair. That is more fair than lollipop sticks and random name generators. Not just asking students because their name flashes up doesn't mean that it's fair. If we're teaching our students better and outcomes are improving because of it, and we're actually questioning the students that we need to be questioning, then that is the fairest, most equitable thing that we can do. So when we've got a strategy that is as powerful as cold calling, then let's not leave it down to chance. Let's not leave it down to those lollipop sticks and random name generators. The second point is around difficulty in that Goldilocks level that I've just been talking about, because of course that Goldilocks level is going to vary student for student, isn't it? And so we need to build a bit of a mental model, an understanding of where our students lie within different topics. And then we need to ensure that students are getting questions that relate to their current attainment. And again, one person's Goldilocks level of difficulty is different to another person's Goldilocks level of difficulty, but the commonality is that it should always be just easing the student out of their comfort zone. As soon as we're asking a question that either doesn't tell us or the student new information, or if we're asking a question that isn't pushing a student outside of their comfort zone, that is a waste of time. That's a waste of 30 seconds. And yeah, Maybe 30 seconds isn't a lot of waste, but if we're wasting 30 seconds 10 times a lesson, then we're wasting 5 minutes every single lesson of the day. Then students have actually wasted 30 minutes in their day, not actually learning. So yeah, it's only 30 seconds, but that time really adds up in a schedule that is really tight, and we're constantly worried about not getting through all of the curriculum. It's also really important that we don't have an opt-out, that we keep coming back to students, because otherwise what we have are students who are refusing to answer questions, who will just keep refusing because they think that they can get out of it. And so we need to return to students either with alternative questions or get them to summarise the points of their colleagues in the class. We need to make sure that students know that if they're not providing an answer or a level of attempt, that they're going to be asked for an input later on in that question, sort of like questioning block or in that lesson. This isn't to say that students have to be correct, far from it, in fact. This is to say that students need to have a level of engagement, and actually a question is designed to measure that. It's a point of assessment, isn't it? And so actually not answering doesn't allow us to glean the information that we require. And that isn't necessarily an overnight thing, it's a more long-term thing, but it is around the culture that we are developing in our classroom. And of course, something that we're going to get onto today is how we can actually utilise process and metacognitive questions during our cold calling, which may in turn support the engagement of some students, or at least ensure that the thought processes that students go through are around metacognition as opposed to anything else. It was Tom Sheringham where I believe I first read about this idea of pose, pause, pounce, and bounce. And it really is to this day still one of the most effective questioning techniques that I've come across and observed. For those unfamiliar, we pose the question to students and then ensure a suitable level of pause. We're not looking to go straight in and ask students the answer straight away. And there's two reasons for that. If we can automatically get a response from students, then we ought not really have asked that question. If students instantly know the answer to a question without having to think, then learning and memory isn't happening, is it, if we go back to that Daniel Willingham quote. So if students automatically know something, yes, sometimes we need to test the automaticity of facts, absolutely, but not most of the time. Most of the time questioning is to stimulate deeper thought and thinking. So we provide a suitable point of pause, and then we cold call the students that we are wanting to actually hear from. And then we bounce that question around the class to get the input of 5, 6, 7, however many different students you're wanting. In an effective scenario, we shouldn't need to repeat the question. We should just be able to say names, and the students will instantly be able to give us their response to the given question. And of course, we need to develop a culture of error, and this idea that being wrong is fantastic so long as we learn from it. I think that second point is important, because otherwise students just accept making mistakes is fine, but actually making mistakes is fine so long as we learn something from them. Making mistakes isn't okay if we then just go on to repeat the mistakes because we didn't take the time to learn from the original error. So developing that culture of error and celebrating mistakes is fantastic, but it's actually the celebration of identification of error and doing something about it. It's about moving forwards. We don't just pat ourselves on the back because we've spotted a mistake. We pat ourselves on the back because we've spotted it and subsequently done something about it. Another common questioning technique is, of course, think, pair, share. And I think that this one is perhaps underutilized. And I think that's perhaps due to student behavior and a fear that discussion in the classroom is maybe not a positive, or perhaps there are concerns that if students start talking, it will be impossible to get them to stop. And of course, there are circumstances where I can completely appreciate that. And there are definitely lessons in this academic year where I've seen that occur, and maybe the better thing would be to have gone to a cold call or a mini whiteboard question where discussion couldn't have been stimulated. But think, pair, share is an incredibly powerful tool, but there are still many ways we can make it better. The first key point is that the questions we're asking in a think, pair, share scenario need to require discussion. If they're closed questions or automatic recall that both students or all students in a group are going to know instantly, then there is no point asking that question. And if there is, then certainly not in a think, pair, share scenario. So in this scenario, we need to be asking questions that stimulate discussion, that maybe have contrasting opinions, require deeper connection, require an evaluation of methods and ideas presented, rather than just the strict recall of a given fact. Before you go straight into the pair, that idea of think is so important. Very much in the pause, this thinking bit is allowing a student to collect their thoughts, to consider what their own response to a given question is. And then I'm a huge advocate of writing time. You'll have seen it in my other webinars. I think that it's really important for students to have the opportunity to translate their tricky thoughts into words on a piece of paper or a whiteboard. Because words are messy in our heads, and when we try and take this messiness of this idea, it's really hard to articulate ideas concisely and accurately in the first instance. We've probably all found that. We've maybe even seen it today with some of the students that we've been teaching. So actually doing think, write, pair, share is an opportunity to far more improve the discussion aspects by giving students a chance to actually note down what it is they're wanting to discuss. Now, I remember speaking to a head of department a lot earlier on in this academic year, probably back in October, November, and we were talking about questioning and discussion and how we can make it more effective and how we can control for behaviours and all of those sorts of things. Now, one of the things that we said, or one of the things that we sort of talked through is what does the process look like for Think, Pair, Share? What happens in the classroom? And we sort of came to the conclusion that several things need to happen for Think, Pair, Share to be done really well. It's always very helpful to model the process. If you've got a teacher you can steal for a couple of minutes, or maybe a teaching assistant in your class, taking the time to model the Think, Write, Pair, Share process to students is incredibly powerful, because then students know what it ought to look like. Otherwise, we've just got a verbal description of what students should be doing and not a physical model. And of course, when we're teaching normal cognitive content, we provide students with a very clear model rather than just talking at them and hoping that they get it. We could also consider the use of scaffolds, such as sentence starters, or reminders about the specific things that students need to be talking about. We could consider, again, sentence starters, modelling and support and feedback for how students actually feedback to each other and how they actually do that sort of discussion aspect in the middle. Other things to think about are your positioning in the classroom. Where does your sort of standpoint within the classroom impact how something like Think, Pair, Share goes? And then how are you providing feedback to students, or how are we holding students to account? So one of the very best things that I saw this year from one of my trainee teachers was that they would do Think, Pair, Share, and then partner B would have to explain what partner A had said and vice versa, thus holding the students to account to really listen and be able to narrate what it is their partner had said. So they really had to understand it because they themselves could be questioned on it. A fantastic way of ensuring that those conversations were effective. So that's Think, Pair, Share. I wanted just to comment on a couple more ideas. So mini whiteboards, I'm an obsessive of a mini whiteboard. But one of the things that I regularly see is that there isn't a consistent routine used. And I think this makes it incredibly difficult for students. And I think it's the biggest piece of feedback that I would give to staff and schools where they're reticent to use mini whiteboards because of behaviour. Kids will mess with pens, they'll mess with whiteboards, they'll flap them in the air. We've all seen that, we've all heard that, and we've all heard that as a reason to not use mini whiteboards. But I firmly believe that having that routine and those ridiculously high expectations is exactly what's needed. If we've got other behavioural concerns in our schools, we deal with them and we develop routines and we develop support structures to ensure that those behaviours are corrected. For some reason, when it comes to many whiteboards, we go, the students are struggling with this. Oh, let's just give up on one of the most effective ways of assessing and questioning our students. So, a consistent routine. And probably, maybe, I'm not sure, but what a very significant part of effective mini whiteboard use is having those mini whiteboards up at the same time. We don't want answers going up sporadically. We don't want students having the opportunity to turn around and have a look at the answers of others. We want students to raise their whiteboards when you say up. They all need to be up at exactly the same time. We don't want students to copy. We don't want students to get scared that others are going to laugh at their answers. All of those answers need to go up at once to avoid those issues and allow you to scan those mini whiteboards quickly. And that's this third bullet point of understanding where to stand. Do you stand in the middle of the room? Do you stand at the corner of a room? Where do you need to stand in your environment? That will allow you to skim those whiteboards quickly, because that's what we need to do. A mini whiteboard should not be something that takes you a minute to have a look for all of the answers, because then you've got a minute of 30 students doing nothing. You've got 30 minutes of wasted learning time. We need to have a very quick skim, allowing you to draw and deduce your assessment and to determine the next steps in the teaching process. And I think it's also important that we consider that balance between the longer methodical, longer form answers and where we're just getting students to write down, oh, it's A, oh, it's B, oh, it's C, oh, it's D. Sometimes it's, what's appropriate? Do we just want students writing letters on a whiteboard? Do we want them to show their method? What do we actually expect from students, and how long is it going to take, and what is the efficiency of that? Which brings us on here to multiple choice questions. Again, something that I absolutely love. And I've said here that we need maybe 3, but almost certainly 4 reasonable choices. Reasonable choices. And all too often, what I've seen are 4 choices where 1 is quite clearly correct, and 3 are quite evidently not correct. They're completely fabricated. And that doesn't draw, and that doesn't help us assess whatsoever. So we need to identify 3 incorrect answers that at least draw upon some fairly sensible, regular misconceptions or mistakes that you've seen students make, even if they're not a misconception. So we need to ensure that if students are getting the answer right, they're actually understanding the answer, at least in the majority of situations. We don't want students just to be able to guess the correct answer. We also may have situations, of course, where students can deduce the correct answer. So they know that it's not A, they know that it's not C, so it's something between B and D, and then they're down to 50-50, and so they'll guess. And then that's okay if they've deduced, because if they've got to the correct answer, at least they know that the other things aren't right, even if they're not completely sure that the thing they've selected is correct. However, this is the sort of scenario where you may want to consider students having to justify their choice. Why have they chosen the option that they have? Is there some method or working out they can provide? Is there a statement? Is there a little follow-up that they can give? What is it that will give you a little bit more insight into their thinking? And the other thing I've seen is, because MCQs are really helpful, people use them all the time. Please just use MCQs if there is a suitable question to ask, not because MCQs are fantastic, because MCQs stop being fantastic where it is not a suitable question. And this now starts to bring us on to the metacognitive aspects, because I would argue that the vast majority of the time we are focusing on cognitive aspects of our questioning. We're asking students questions such as, well, what am I going to do next? What is the answer? How much do you need to write? And some of those start to go into monitoring and regulation and planning, but the majority of the time we're asking cognitive questions. We're asking very key fact recall, knowledge recall, formula recall, whatever it might be. We're asking very specific cognitive questions and not necessarily metacognitive questions. And so if we go back to Daniel's quote right at the beginning of the session that said memory is the residue of thought, or learning is the residue of thought, how are we going to develop metacognition? How do we develop metacognition if we don't direct students' attention to it? If in our questioning we never question students about metacognitive elements, why are students going to develop metacognition? They're not. That's the point, isn't it? That unless we're asking questions that move that spotlight onto the metacognition, it's a sudden shift from the actor to the stage director. That's what we're looking for, isn't it? It's moving beyond the cognition to the meta aspects. And so we need to shine the light on it. It's moving the spotlight from the puppet to the puppeteer. What is driving those actions? What is driving those thoughts? That is what we need to start questioning. And that's not to say that we don't ask cognitive questions. It's not to say we don't ask what the answer is. It's not to say that we don't ask students to recall a fact or a formula or provide us with a statistic or a quote. Of course it isn't. It's just to say that if we're wanting to develop metacognition, then we need to actually place the spotlight of attention onto those metacognitive elements. So let's get started and let's have a think on some of the things that we could possibly do in our classroom. So one of the first and most important areas is through developing connection. So what do we want to do? We want to direct attention and we want to direct thought to connections between current and previous tasks. Of course, this is fantastic for retrieval, but it's about getting students, as much for retrieval, to actually understand what it is they did previously and what evaluations they concluded from that previous task. So it's not just about, can you recall this fact, but it's about, well, how did it go last time? What's the same? What's different? Hence, what may you do differently? What might you do the same? Etc., etc. So conceptual variation, what is the same, what is different? And of course, connection type questions are things that can be embedded in every single lesson. So why would we do this? Like I've said, it allows our students not just to recall really helpful information, but it does help students to consider where they've done things previously and learn from that evaluation, learn from previous attempt and go from there. Rather than just trying to recall information, we actually want students to learn and build from their previous evaluation. But of course, cognitively, it does have a massive and positive impact on developing student schema and drawing links between ideas and learning episodes as well. So what might this look like? So obviously I come from a maths background, and so one of the resources that I was always very, very keen on, still very, very keen on now whenever I'm doing any maths training, are some of the superb variation theory questions that Craig Barton provides on his website. And the beauty of these questions is, as standalone questions, they're really, really good. But as a group of questions, you can start to see variances, hence variation theory, variances between the questions themselves. And questions are typically grouped together. Now, questions that I might ask students about these four given on the board is, well, what is varying between each question? Well, what impact is this going to have on the answer? I don't know. I don't need to know what the answer is. What I need to know is, what impact is this going to have? I might ask students about what mistakes might be made. I could ask students about how we can ensure that our answers are correct. And though that's moving on a little bit from connections, it's still in that metacognitive ballpark of monitoring and evaluation. So it all builds on each other, and it's really directing that thought to, well, actually, let's not just get the answer, but what's the same, what's different? How am I building up my schema? What did I do before? What's the same? What's different? How can I learn from that? This is a science example, and we can see here we've got a nice double bubble diagram comparing animals that live in water and those that live in the land. Double bubble, for those who aren't all that familiar, is basically an easy to use Venn diagram where the common connections in the center are common, of course, to both categories, and those ideas around the outside of each bubble are individual to those specific contexts, i.e. that's why we have a crab in the center, but a panda in the lives on land and a dolphin in the lives in water. So here, again, we could use this as a resource, and we could say, right, well, what animals are fitting into both categories? What is linking those animals in both categories? What is the same and what is different about those animals? So potentially that's when we're getting students to place those animals within those categories. We're getting them to compare, we're getting them to contrast, we're getting them to draw connections. What's the same between all of those things in the middle? What's different, or maybe what's even the same about the things on the outside? And again, drawing in connections. One of the connections that we might even want to draw with this is, why are we using a double bubble, and where have we seen this type of graphic organized before, and why do we use it? Again, retrieving and connecting all of that deeper knowledge together. Students in a geography topic might be asked a couple of questions, and in one lesson or 1 week they might be asked to explain the formation of an oxbow lake, and then in a following lesson or week they might be asked to explain the formation of a waterfall. And so we may make it a key teaching point for students to reflect on the first question that they did, and actually get students to consider, well, what is similar about these questions? What are commonalities between what they're asking us to do in these questions? You're also then going to want to think about how maybe your responses will vary. So considering what is the same allows us to illuminate what is different between these two questions, and hence, how is your response going to vary? And then maybe if students had done question 1 before, we can try and learn and evaluate from that to better inform the response for the second question. So again, you can see how a lot of these connection questions get into a lot of deeper thinking quite quickly. This is an example that I took from one of the harder international books, Year 7 Teaching, and you can see here that quite clearly contrasted here are Python and MicroPython, and a flowchart is given. And I don't know anything about computing, and I believe, and according to this, it appears that Python and MicroPython are different. So if the name's to be believed, they are. And so what we can do, what we can question students about is, well, how does the usability compare? How difficult is it to program both of these different things? Why might you use one over the other? Comparing, contrasting, building connections, getting students to link ideas together rather than having all of these information blocks, these knowledge blocks in isolation. So in essence, we're wanting to ask questions around really these 5 ideas. How do questions relate to each other, and hence what did we learn in one question that we can apply to another? How are topics relating to each other, and what's similar, what's different, what's the same, blah, blah, blah. How can that prior learning support our future learning? What skills have you learned previously that you might still be able to use? And what did you do well, or what do you need to improve on from the last time you did that question? And that brings us on now to our second question, which is strategy comparison. So what is strategy comparison? We've talked about this before in the last webinar as a teacher-led modelling directive. But actually, it can very much be a questioning strategy that we use with our students. And what we do is, instead of just modeling to students the relative strengths and weaknesses and appropriateness of alternative strategies, what we would actually do is we would also question students around the choices that they're making with regards to the strategies that they are employing, and getting students to critically consider the strengths, weaknesses, and appropriateness of those given approaches. Now, I've suggested here that if we're going to start questioning students about the approaches that they're taking, and we're getting them to critically consider how effective they are, then of course that's probably going to need students to be far more comfortable and automatic with the content and the strategies available to them. Otherwise, we're going to be placing significant cognitive load demands on our students. There needs to be some level of cognitive automaticity before we can potentially turn our attention to this type of question. And of course, asking students questions about alternative approaches is not going to be suitable where there is no reasonable alternative approach. So why would we do this? What is the importance of asking questions like this? Well, very much like when we discussed it with regards to modelling, it helps students to build a deeper knowledge of strategy appropriateness. And this is huge, because otherwise what we have are students just using strategies because it's the one that they know, it's the one that they're used to, it's the one that they're comfortable with and their friends use and they've always used it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way of going about things. And so we need students to be able to develop an understanding of when to and when not to use particular strategies. And this, of course, improves problem solving and learner flexibility, because we often know that learner flexibility and problem solving is impacted by an inability to consider alternative problems, to consider alternative strategies and consider the very best way through the problems that they are facing. So by asking students to consider the questions that they're having to, the strategies that they're deploying, of course, illuminating those aspects is going to make the students better at problem solving and becoming more flexible. So one of the questions that I love using, if you've been in any training with me this year, you might have seen the question before. I'm always asking this question of 8 multiplied by 0.3, because there are just so many ways of answering it. And actually, this would be a great one to put on the board, get students to work out and ask them why they use different approaches, and why is one approach more effective than another? Why would you use a given approach for this question? And getting students to sort of, again, do that compare, contrast, strengths and weaknesses. We could do it in terms of write-ups and writing frames here, Maybe if students are having to compare one mammal and one amphibian and the life cycles, then actually students would, maybe they're going to describe all of the life cycle of the mammal and then the amphibian, but maybe they could try and write it and sort of compare and contrast as they go and have sort of that continuous prose. And maybe that would be a better way of doing it, so students can compare and contrast those different options. Students could also discuss, obviously, the writing frame around something like benefits and drawbacks. Do they want to list all the benefits first and then list all of the drawbacks? Or do they want to think about interlinking the benefits and drawbacks for that smoother prose and conclusions? So again, plenty to think about there, but really drilling down into the why have you used that strategy? What's good about that strategy? Is there a different way you could have done it? Why was that the best way of answering this given question? Those are just some of the things that we could ask our learners. Now, the third thing that I really think that we need to focus some of our questioning attention on is comprehension. So comprehension very much links into knowledge of task, that very first foundation of effective metacognitive development. And we said that knowledge of task is like we said, effective comprehension, understanding precisely what it is you have to do in order to accurately complete a question. And if students don't understand effectively what it is they have to do, they're very unlikely to hit the goals and the success criteria at the end of the task. So in effect, if students only have a poor comprehension of a question, of a task, they're very unlikely to do well. So we need to ensure that we're asking copious questions around comprehension, and not just how long do you have, like I've sort of suggested there, but actually, how do you know what method you've got to use? How do you know what layout it's supposed to be? Why are you given certain information? What is the impact of this? How do you know that you are correct? How do you know that your answer needs to look like this? And just saying, oh, because it always does, or because that's what you told us, that isn't helpful, because we need students to be independent, individual thinkers. And in short, what's the point of this? Well, if we improve comprehension, for example, by really shining the spotlight on the effectiveness of comprehension, not just being able to say what word to focus on, but what that word actually means and the impact it has on our response. So if we really get into that improved efficiency and effectiveness of comprehension, that in turn improves planning, and improved planning leads to improved outcomes. It's as simple as that. Improve our comprehension, our planning will be better. And if our planning better, our outcomes are going to be better themselves. Now, one of the questions that I love to highlight is this fantastic maths question, and it really is a nice question. But I've highlighted all of the subject-specific and even just contextual words that students would need to know. If students don't know what right-angled mean, or if they don't know what a triangle is, if a student doesn't know what a coordinate grid is, or if they don't know the context, or that they don't have a deeper understanding of the word repeatedly or form, because again, repeatedly and form are words used outside mathematics and they have different meanings. If students don't know what diagram means, or they don't know what coordinates are, if they don't know any of those things, their comprehension is going to be weakened. And so we need to build up effective comprehension from students so that they can effectively answer questions like the one on the screen. So we might ask questions of our students such as, what are you being asked to find? In what form? What are the keywords and what do they mean? What are you going to have to calculate? Why have you been given certain information, or why is that information important, or why is it relevant? A question here, an AQA history past paper. Again, if a student doesn't correctly comprehend this question, they're not going to get the 12 marks. So we might start off with questions such as, well, how long do you have? But then we may move on to things like, well, what's the keywords? And how do you know that those are the keywords? How do you know that they are directing what you should be doing? Are you aware of what exactly the key command word is? And do you know what that word means precisely? And what points are you going to have to make to hit those marking criteria, those success criteria effectively? So again, it's about delving into that comprehension and really focusing on that efficiency. Here, maybe a more slightly straightforward question, but something along the lines of, through the sketching and annotation of a diagram, explain the formation of a river. So again, really drilling down to students rather than just giving them the question saying, you've got 5 minutes, off you go. But what are you being asked to do? What should it look like? Considering what it says, what should you see? And actually don't just settle for going, oh, they do know, Don't just settle for a student going, oh, well, we know, come on, just let us get on with it. They need to be able to narrate it, because there will be a student who doesn't get this question right because they've not thought about it properly in the first instance. We need students to think about the keywords like annotation, for example, or sketching. What do they mean? Because sketching doesn't mean the world's most accurate diagram of rulers and measures and all of that sort of thing. It just means a sketch. It just means a helpful diagram to be able to make a point. And then we could say, why have you been given certain information? Why have you been asked certain things? Again, exactly the same questions we could ask of this task in a history lesson. In chronological order, consider 8 events in Roman history. Well, what are you being asked to do? In what format do you have to do it? Well, it's in chronological order. If you're not presenting your answer in chronological order, then you're not going to get the marks. Oh, you don't know what chronological means. Okay, good. So we didn't have an accurate comprehension of task. And then the last thing that I want to leave you with in this session are just generally more metacognitive questions. So I've talked about connection questions, I've talked about comprehension questions, I've talked about strategy questions. And of course, these things really, in effect, they're really hitting the knowledge of tasks, so comprehension questions, the knowledge of self, so almost those connection questions, where have I done it before, what did I learn, blah, blah, blah. And then the strategy questions are, of course, knowledge of strategy. So asking those sets of questions are really going to develop that knowledge of cognition part of a student's learning. Remember our 2 parts of metacognition, our regulation, plan, monitor, evaluate, and our knowledge of cognition, the knowledge of task, self, and strategies. So connection questions, comprehension questions, and strategy questions will nail off those first 3 things. But of course, we might want to think about planning, we might want to think about monitoring, we might want to think about evaluation. And so what I've provided here, and you'll have obviously a better opportunity when the slides are released later on this evening, I've released a set of questions. These are all available in my first book. So if you don't have a copy right now, the book's having a bit of a renaissance right now. It's smashed through the top 100 in the chat again, which is absolutely fantastic. But there are loads and loads and loads of questions given in the book. I can't find an example now for looking, but there are loads and loads of examples given, and these are actually pulled directly from the book, so you can access them here, but there are a few more given within the book as well. So what are the keyword, the top 1 comprehension questions, you've got those connections that we've just looked at, strategies, evaluation down there at the bottom. How successful were you? Maybe that's quite cognitive. How do you know? That's the meta. What went well in the task? How do you know? It's not that first evaluation. It's not just the what went well. It's the what went well and how do you know that? What is your evidence? How sure are you? What might you need greater support with next time? How is that going to help? What were you going to do differently? What are you going to do the same? So it's about taking on a level and making this consideration, the meta consideration, that much deeper. Even more questions here around planning, about monitoring, evaluation, and some questions that relate precisely to knowledge of self, knowledge of task, and then knowledge of strategies down there at the bottom. So once again, those are all going to be on the slides, which I will save as a PDF and then upload onto the website as well, that you will all be able to access. And those and more, of course, my first book. And this actually brings us to the end of today's session. So wrapped up with a few minutes to spare. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or to the question function. Once again, I'll just say, please do leave any feedback that you have got on social media. Please do share any photos that you've taken on social media. That'd be absolutely fantastic for me to see. The one thing that I would ask you to do, and I'll flick back to it in a second, is there is a survey there on the right-hand side. If you'd be kind enough to scan the QR code, ask any questions that you've got. That's a fantastic place to put any questions in that survey. Please just make sure that you leave your email address so that I can get back to you. If for whatever reason I've missed the comments, because there are, and thank you so much, there were so many people doing it. So if I do miss any questions, please do just drop me an email. Please do reach out to me on any of those social media channels. So our next session is this coming Tuesday, so in 5 days time, where we're going to be having like an improving feedback and evaluation. So the little caption for that is ensuring that approaches, exploring approaches to ensure that feedback is effective and is utilised, because far too often feedback just isn't used effectively. We might have the best feedback policies in the world, but if that feedback isn't being used, then it is a bit of a waste of time. And then actually a week today, our other Thursday session, we're going to be having a look at developing independent and resilient learners. And then in just under 2 weeks, we'll be wrapping up on the 22nd with probably a slightly shorter session. We'll see how that one goes, which will be around ensuring effective revision. So I will leave it back on this screen, and this is where I will pause things. So please do fill in that survey. It should only take you about 20-30 seconds unless you've got a question. Would be really very appreciative of that. And if you do have any questions, please do pop them into the chat. I'm more than happy to answer them now. But equally, you can, of course, just pop them into the survey link and I'll get back to you over the weekend. But thank you so much for everybody who has attended live. Hopefully lots of food for thought for you there around effective questioning types, and then how we move that spotlight onto metacognition with our questioning. That's everything from me. So unless you've got a question and you want to pop that into the chat, thank you so much for joining live. And everybody on the recording, thank you ever so much for catching up. If you're also able to do the survey, that would be very much appreciated. But thank you, everybody. I really hope you got a lot out of today. I will hang about for a few seconds to wait for any questions that may drip on in. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the next webinar and taking any questions by message and email. Thank you so much for joining.